Silas Whitmore gestured toward his stepdaughter with the casual dismissal of a man discarding old clothes. "Take her, Brennan. Consider your debt paid." The words hung in the parlor air like smoke from a dying fire. Cordelia sat motionless in her wheelchair beside the window, her dark hands folded with deliberate precision in her lap. The afternoon light caught the angles of her face, revealing nothing. Her silence was armor. Tobias Brennan stood hat in hand, his weathered fingers working the brim. The $500 might as well have been 5,000. Debtor's prison waited for men who couldn't pay their accounts. His sister back east needed that money. The consumption was eating her alive. "She's educated," Silas continued, his voice thick with mockery. "Can read and cipher better than most men. Course, that don't make her worth much now." His eyes found Cordelia with cruel satisfaction. Not since the accident. The wheelchair had become her prison 3 years ago, a spooked horse. A fall that stole her legs but left everything else intact. Her mind remained sharp as winter wind. Her spirit burned beneath the surface like banked coals. Tobias studied the floorboards. Good pine, well maintained, unlike the man who owned them. "This ain't right. Right don't pay debts." Silas moved to his desk, pulled out papers. "You take her off my hands, we call it square. Otherwise, that money comes due tomorrow." Cordelia spoke for the first time. "And if he refuses?" Her stepfather's smile was thin ice over deep water. "Already got papers drawn up for that special institution in Santa Fe. They know how to care for folks like you." The threat settled into the room like dust after a stampede. Tobias knew about such places. Warehouses for broken people. Cordelia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're talking about a person, not livestock." "I'm talking about a burden I've carried too long." Silas signed the papers with flourishes that mocked the gravity of the moment. "My late wife's mistake ain't my responsibility forever." The cruelty was calculated, precise. Cordelia had heard these words before, carved into her heart one syllable at a time over 3 long years. She met Tobias's gaze across the room. Her eyes held no plea, only evaluation. She was measuring him like she might measure a horse, looking for weakness, cowardice. Tobias saw intelligence there, pride held together with determination. This woman was no man's burden. She was surviving in a world that had decided she was worthless. "The cabin by the creek," he said finally. "She can have privacy there." Silas chuckled. "Privacy, sure, Brennan. Whatever helps you sleep." The transaction was completed with scratched signatures and handshakes that felt like grave dirt. Cordelia said nothing as arrangements were made around her. She had learned long ago that speaking in such moments only invited fresh cruelty. An hour later, Tobias loaded her belongings into his wagon. 3 trunks, a sewing basket, books wrapped in oilcloth. More possessions than he'd expected. Cordelia transferred herself from wheelchair to wagon seat with practiced efficiency. Her arms were strong from 3 years of necessity. They rode toward the creek cabin in silence. The late afternoon sun painted the landscape in amber and shadow. Dust devils spun themselves to death in the distance. The land was beautiful and harsh, like survival itself. "You don't have to pretend this is kindness," she said finally. Tobias kept his eyes on the rutted road. "Ain't pretending nothing." "Then what are you doing?" He considered this. The wagon wheels found every stone, every hole. His sister's last letter sat folded in his shirt pocket. Her handwriting had grown shaky, desperate. The money would buy her months, maybe a year, trying to do right by impossible circumstances. Cordelia studied his profile. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into sun and wind. His hands on the reins were gentle but sure. She had watched him work horses. He never used more force than necessary, never struck in anger. "And what does right look like to you?" The cabin appeared ahead, small but solid. Tobias had built it himself 2 summers ago. Clean lines, good foundation, windows that caught morning light. He pulled the wagon up to the porch. "Respect," he said. "Whatever else happens, you deserve that." He climbed down and began unloading her trunks. Strong shoulders, efficient movements. No hurry, no hesitation. Cordelia watched him work and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not hope exactly, something smaller but more durable. The possibility that not all men were Sela's Whitmore. That evening, after her belongings were arranged and the wheelchair positioned by the window, Tobias stood in the doorway. Hat in hand again, uncertain. "I'll bring supplies tomorrow, food, firewood, whatever you need. And then we figure out how to live with this." He left her alone as darkness settled over the creek. Cordelia sat by the window and listened to water moving over stones. For the first time in 3 years, no one would monitor her movements, count her meals, measure her worth against her usefulness. The silence was different here. Not empty, full of possibility. Outside, night sounds began their ancient chorus. Somewhere in the darkness, Tobias Brennan was probably staring at stars and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Cordelia wondered the same thing, but wondering felt better than dying by degrees in Sela's Whitmore's house of casual cruelties. Tobias arrived at dawn with coffee beans and flour. Cordelia was already awake, positioned by the eastern window where morning light caught the pages of her book. She looked up when his boots found the porch boards. "You read early," he said. "Sleep comes hard in new places." He understood. The cabin held different sounds than the main house. Creek water instead of grandfather clocks. Wine through cottonwoods instead of Sela's pacing overhead. Freedom had its own rhythms. She watched him stock the kitchen shelves. His movements were careful, quiet, respectful of her space. When he finished, he lingered by the door. "Need anything else?" "Time," he nodded and left her to the morning. By the second week they had established patterns. Tobias brought supplies each dawn. Cordelia acknowledged his presence with small gestures, a nod, fresh coffee waiting. Questions about ranch business that surprised him with their precision. "The Morgan mare is favoring her left front," she observed one morning. He paused in stacking firewood. "You've been watching the horses." "I watch everything." Her eyes held intelligence that cut through pretense. Tobias realized she had been studying him too, measuring his character through accumulated small actions. The town noticed their arrangement quickly. Whispers followed Tobias through the general store. Knowing looks, crude assumptions about what transpired in the creek cabin. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter when he passed. Old Pete at the saloon offered commentary that made decent men turn away. Heard Sela's finally found a use for that crippled girl. Tobias bought his supplies without response. Words wouldn't change minds already made up, but the poison settled in his chest anyway. Cordelia faced her own trials. Her first trip to town for fabric brought stares that burned through her traveling dress. Women gathered their children closer. Men averted their eyes or studied her too intently. The shopkeeper's wife spoke to her in the slow, loud voice reserved for simpletons. "Do you need help reading these prices, dear?" Cordelia's spine straightened. "I can manage." She bought her thread and left without another word. The wagon ride home stretched endlessly under the weight of judgment. That evening, Tobias found her sitting by the creek. Her wheelchair had navigated the rough path to the water's edge. Moonlight caught the tears she hadn't bothered to hide. "Town was hard today," he said. "They think I'm your kept woman." The words hung between them. Tobias settled on a fallen log upstream, close enough for conversation, far enough to preserve propriety. "They think what they want to think." "And what do you think?" He watched water move over stones, each current finding its own path around obstacles. "I think you're the strongest person I've met." She turned to study his profile. No pity in his expression, no false comfort, just recognition of something real. Strength doesn't change what people see. People see what they expect to see. Don't make it true. A week later, fever found her. It came with autumn's first cold snap, settling into her chest like smoke. Tobias arrived at dawn to find her struggling to light the stove. Her hands shook. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the morning chill. "You're burning up." "I'll manage." But she couldn't. The fever climbed through the day, stealing her strength. Tobias stayed, made willow bark tea, kept the fire burning. cooled her face with creek water when the heat spiked. She drifted in and out of consciousness. In her clearer moments, she found him sitting beside the bed, patient as stone, present without presumption. "You don't owe me this," she whispered. "Ain't about owing." "Then what?" He adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. His touch was careful, distant. "Decent folks take care of each other." The fever broke on the third night. Cordelia woke to find Tobias asleep in the chair beside her bed, his chin on his chest, stubble shadowing his jaw. He had stayed through the worst of it, expected nothing, asked for nothing. When he stirred and found her watching him, she saw exhaustion in his eyes, relief. "Better, better." He rose stiffly, worked the kinks from his neck. "I'll make breakfast." "Tobias." He turned at the bedroom door. "Thank you." The words were simple, insufficient. They carried weight that surprised them both. After that, the space between them felt different, less careful, more real. Cordelia began helping with ranch bookkeeping when her strength returned. Numbers had always made sense to her, order from chaos, logic from complexity. She spread the ledgers across the kitchen table and worked by lamplight. Tobias watched her organize months of scattered records into clear columns. Her writing was precise, elegant, each entry perfectly aligned. "Where did you learn to cipher like that?" "My mother insisted on education. Said it was the one thing nobody could take away." She had been wrong about that. The accident had taken away choices, opportunities, futures, but it had left her mind intact, sharp as ever, maybe sharper. "These numbers don't add up," she said, pointing to a column of feed expenses. Tobias leaned closer to see. Her finger traced the error. This close, he could smell soap and lavender in her hair, see the concentration in her dark eyes. "Silas has been skimming money." "How much?" "Near $200 over 6 months. The theft was methodical, small amounts from multiple accounts." Cordelia's trained eye caught the pattern that less careful bookkeeping had missed. "You could report this." She looked up at him. "And say what? That the crippled girl nobody listens to caught her stepfather stealing." The bitterness in her voice was earned. Tobias understood. Justice required credibility. Credibility required standing in the community. Neither of them possessed enough of either. "Then we keep our own records," he said. "Document everything." That night, working by firelight, they began building a case from careful documentation. Two people society had discarded, proving their worth through precision and persistence. Outside, wind moved through dying grass. The sound was lonely but not empty. Change was coming with winter. Neither of them could name what they were building together, but it felt solid, real, worth defending. November brought the first hard frost. Ice formed overnight in water troughs, thin as window glass but sharp enough to cut unwary fingers. Cordelia watched from her window as Tobias broke the surface with a hammer, freeing water for thirsty cattle. "Storm coming," she said when he brought morning coffee. He studied the sky through her window. Clouds gathered like gray wool, heavy with promise. "How do you know?" "The way the light changes. My mother taught me to read weather." She spoke of her mother rarely. The woman had been born free in Pennsylvania, educated by Quakers, married to a man who saw intelligence as beauty's equal. Death from fever had left Cordelia orphaned at 16, vulnerable to Silas Whitmore's cold calculations about convenient marriages. "She sounds wise. Wise enough to hide money where he couldn't find it." The words slipped out before caution could stop them. Tobias set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "What money?" Cordelia's hands found the wheels of her chair. She had lived 3 years guarding this secret. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But watching Tobias through fevered dreams, seeing him choose kindness without audience or reward, had cracked something open inside her chest. She wheeled to the bedroom, returned with a wooden box carved with roses. Her mother's jewelry case. The false bottom opened under pressure from her thumbs. Bills lay folded beneath faded velvet. $20 notes, tens, fives. More money than Tobias had seen in one place outside a bank. $300, she said. "Maybe $320. He stared at the cash. "How long have you been saving?" Since the accident, Silas gives me household money. I spend half, hide half. Been planning to buy land in Colorado territory. Start fresh where nobody knows what I was before. The revelation shifted everything between them. Cordelia wasn't waiting for rescue. She was engineering her own escape with the patience of water wearing down stone. He don't know. Silas thinks I'm too simple to manage more than grocery money. She counted the bills with practiced fingers. Each note represented weeks of careful economy. Meals stretched thin, mended clothes instead of new ones, freedom purchased in $5 increments. Why tell me? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Cordelia folded the money back into its hiding place, her movements precise as a clockmaker's. Because you stayed when I was sick. Because you look at me and see a person, not a problem. Trust was fragile as creek ice, easily broken, impossible to repair once shattered. She was offering him something more valuable than money. The chance to know who she really was beneath survival's careful mask. Tobias understood the weight of her confession. Your secret's safe. Is it? She studied his face for tells. Greed had its own expressions. So did betrayal. She found neither. Only the steady regard she had come to recognize as his truest quality. It is. The storm arrived that afternoon with wind that bent cottonwoods horizontal. Rain turned to sleet, then snow. Tobias stayed to help board windows, bank the fire, prepare for a siege of weather. They worked together without wasted motion. He hammered shutters while she sorted candles, checked food stores, filled every container with water. Partnership born from shared necessity. When preparation was complete, they sat by the fire and watched flames consume split pine. Snow piled against the windows. The cabin became an island in a white sea. Tell me about Colorado, he said. Cordelia's eyes found the flames. Heard there's good land near Denver, cheap for folks willing to work it. Nobody cares much about your past if you pull your weight. You could run a ranch. I could run anything if given the chance. Her voice carried conviction earned through years of proving herself worthy of space she occupied. Tobias believed her. Intelligence was rarer than gold, more valuable than cattle. Cordelia possessed both in abundance. What about winter? Heavy snows up there. I'd manage, she would too. This woman who had survived Silas Whitmore's cruelties, who had saved money nickel by nickel while planning escape routes, could survive anything. But surviving and thriving were different territories entirely. Might get lonely. Running a place alone. Something flickered in her expression, quickly hidden but not quite fast enough. Lonely's better than staying where you're not wanted. The fire crackled between them. Outside, wind howled through bare branches with the voice of wolves. Neither spoke for long minutes. Sometimes silence carried more weight than words. Could use a partner, she said finally. Someone good with horses. Fair with numbers. The offer was carefully neutral. Business proposition dressed as casual observation. But her eyes betrayed deeper currents. Hope held in check by fear of presumption. Tobias poked the fire with an iron rod. Sparks rose like tiny stars, brief and bright before dying in the darkness above. Partner would need his own stake. Can't build much on good intentions. How much you figure it would take? 2 people, starting fresh. Maybe 500, 6 to be safe. The numbers settled between them like cards on a table. She had 300. He had nothing but debts and dreams. The gap was wide as a canyon, deep as disappointment. Might be other ways to raise money, she said. Legal ways. Her smile was thin as paper, sharp as steel. Legal enough. That night, as snow continued falling, Cordelia told him about her mother's marriage papers. Documents proving ownership of property that Silas had claimed through convenience and assumed ignorance. Her mother had been legally entitled to half the ranch. By inheritance, those rights belonged to Cordelia. He destroyed the originals, she said, but copies exist at the territorial courthouse. Been meaning to make a trip to Santa Fe. Understanding dawned slowly. This woman had been planning more than escape. She had been planning revolution. The systematic reclamation of everything stolen from her through grief and circumstance. That's dangerous thinking. Living with Silas Whitmore is dangerous. At least this way, I choose my own risks. The fire burned low while they talked through possibilities, obstacles, consequences. Two people who had been handed impossible circumstances, discovering they might have the tools to reshape their world. Outside, the storm raged until dawn. Inside, by firelight, they built plans from hope and determination. Neither spoke of the deeper current flowing between them, but both felt its pull. Some partnerships were born from necessity, others from recognition of kindred spirits. The best ones grew from both. When morning came, the world was transformed. Snow covered everything in white silence. Pure, new, full of possibility, they stood together at the window, watching sunlight turn the landscape to crystal. Two people at the edge of something larger than survival, something that might be called hope. Spring came early that year, melting snow into streams that carved new paths through winter-hardened earth. Cordelia watched ice break apart on the creek, chunks spinning downstream toward destinations unknown. Change was in the air, thick as pollen. Tobias had been different since the storm, more present somehow. Their morning conversation stretched longer. He lingered after delivering supplies, finding reasons to repair loose boards or oil squeaky hinges. Small courtesies that spoke louder than words. "Garden plots ready for planting," he said one morning. She looked through the window at the turned earth. He had built raised beds she could tend from her wheelchair. The soil was dark, rich with promise. "What grows well here? Beans, squash, corn if you start early enough." He had thought this through, researched what would thrive, what would feed two people through a hard winter. The assumption of shared future was woven into every furrow. But Silas had begun circling their contentment with increasing frequency. He appeared at the creek cabin unannounced, citing ranch business that required Tobias elsewhere. His eyes measured their comfort, cataloged small improvements, noted the ease growing between them. "Getting mighty domestic out here," he observed during one visit. Cordelia kept her hands busy with sewing. "I appreciate a well-maintained home." "Course you do. Question is whether Brennan's maintaining more than just the cabin." The insinuation hung in the air like gun smoke. Tobias straightened from the harness he was mending, his jaw tight as fence wire. "Something you want to say plain," Silas smiled with all the warmth of winter wind. "Just noting how comfortable you two have gotten. Might be time to move on, take your problem with you." The threat was clear. Their arrangement had been meant as temporary humiliation. Instead, it had become something that looked dangerously close to happiness. That wasn't part of Silas's plan. That evening, Cordelia found Tobias sitting by the creek, staring at water that reflected stars between its currents. She wheeled her chair beside him, close enough to share the darkness. "He's getting worried," she said. "About what?" "That people might start seeing this as legitimate, you and me together." The words settled between them like stones dropped in still water. They had been dancing around the truth for weeks, the careful distance maintained in public, the longer glances when they thought the other wasn't watching. "What do you see it as?" Her question was quiet, careful, loaded with possibilities that could explode in her face if she had misjudged the currents flowing between them. Tobias picked up a smooth stone, turned it over in his palm. "I see two people who understand each other, who work well together. And," the stone skipped across water, counting ripples before sinking, "and I see a woman I've come to care about more than is probably wise." Admission hung between them like bridge spanning dangerous water. One step forward would change everything. One step back would preserve the safety of friendship but doom them to careful distance forever. "Caring's not wisdom," she said finally, "but it's honest." He turned to look at her then, really look. Not the quick glances of shared work or polite conversation. This was the regard of a man seeing a woman, measuring the distance between want and possibility. "Honest don't make it simple. Nothing about us is simple." True enough. She was a black woman with broken legs living on charity. He was an Irish cowboy drowning in debt. Society had no place for what was growing between them, No words for partnership that wasn't based on ownership or pity. "People talk," he said. "People have been talking since the day you brought me here." Also true, they had nothing to lose in terms of reputation. Both had been written off by polite society already. The freedom in that realization was intoxicating as whiskey. 2 weeks later, thunderheads built on the western horizon like purple mountains. Cordelia watched them grow, read the promise of violence in their towering heights. The air grew still, heavy with electricity that made her skin prickle. Tobias was late returning from the range. She waited by the window as lightning began its distant dance. When the first fat raindrops struck glass, she wheeled to the door, straining to see through gathering darkness. The storm arrived with fury that bent trees horizontal. Rain came in sheets that obscured everything beyond the porch. Wind howled like something dying. She lit every lamp in the cabin, hoping their glow would guide him home. When the front window blew open, she struggled to reach it from her chair. The latch was high, awkward. Rain soaked the floor, the rug her mother had braided years ago. She stretched upward, fingertips barely brushing the wooden frame. The chair tilted. Balance shifted. She fell forward, her body striking the floor with impact that drove breath from her lungs. Pain shot through her ribs. The wheelchair lay on its side, wheels spinning uselessly. Tobias found her there when he burst through the door minutes later, soaked to the skin and wild with worry. He knelt beside her without hesitation, hands checking for injury with the gentleness he used on spooked horses. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so." But she was shaking. From cold, from shock, from the helplessness that always lurked beneath her careful independence. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, cradled her against his chest while rain continued its assault on the windows. "The chair," she said. "I'll get it." But he didn't move. Neither did she. They stayed frozen in that moment, her body warm against his arms strong around her shoulders. The storm raged outside while something quieter but equally powerful built between them. "Cordelia." Her name on his lips was question and answer both. She looked up into eyes that held nothing back. No pity, no calculation, only recognition of something that had been growing since that first morning when he brought coffee and respect in equal measure. "I know," she whispered. He kissed her then, soft as spring rain on drought-hardened earth. She kissed him back, her hands finding the wet fabric of his shirt, the solid warmth of the man beneath. When they finally broke apart, the storm was beginning to ease. Lightning moved eastward, chasing distant horizons. The worst was over, but something fundamental had shifted in its wake. "This changes things," he said. "Everything's been changing since the day we met." He righted her wheelchair, helped her settle into it with hands that lingered on her shoulders. The touching was different now, deliberate, claimed. "What do we do now?" She looked around the cabin they had made into home through shared work and growing trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Silas's anger, society's judgment, the thousand small cruelties reserved for people who dared to love across lines others had drawn in sand. "We build something worth defending." Outside, the storm moved on toward other territories. Inside, by lamplight, two people began planning a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. Love was like that. Lightning striking in the darkness, illuminating landscape you never knew existed. Silas noticed the change immediately. It lived in small details that screamed louder than words. The way Tobias lingered at the creek cabin each morning. How Cordelia's laughter carried on summer wind when she thought no one was listening. The garden flourishing under their shared care. He arrived unannounced on a Tuesday, his horse's hooves announcing his approach across sun-baked earth. Cordelia was hanging laundry while Tobias repaired a fence post. Domestic tranquility that made Silas's jaw clench tight as a bear trap. "Mighty cozy setup you got here." Tobias straightened, hammer still in his grip. "Something you need." "What I need is for you to remember our arrangement was temporary. Time to move on, take her with you." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Cordelia's hands stilled on the clothesline. She had been expecting this moment since the night of the storm, dreading it, preparing for it. Arrangements working fine as is, Tobias said. Silas stepped closer, his bulk casting shadow across the garden where tomatoes hung heavy on the vine. Working too fine. People are starting to talk, treating this situation like it's legitimate. And what if it is? The question hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, dangerous, unpredictable, capable of consuming everything in its path. Silas's laugh was dry as desert wind. Legitimate? You think parading around with damaged goods makes you respectable? Think again, Brennan. Cordelia wheeled her chair forward, her voice steady as granite. I'm standing right here. You're sitting. Like always. His eyes found hers with familiar cruelty. Don't matter anyway. Already got papers drawn up to have you committed. That institution in Santa Fe is expecting you by month's end. The threat was real. Cordelia saw it in his face, heard it in the satisfaction that colored his voice. He had been planning this while she and Tobias built their fragile happiness. On what grounds? Mental incompetence, delusions of grandeur, living in sin with hired help. He counted the charges on his fingers. Dr. Marsh will sign whatever I ask him to sign. Dr. Marsh owed Silas money, lots of it, the kind of debt that made men flexible about medical ethics. That evening, after Silas rode away trailing threats like dust clouds, Cordelia sat by her bedroom window staring at stars that offered no answers. Tobias found her there, his face grim as winter sky. We could run, he said. Where? How far you think we'd get before he caught us? Not far. A woman in a wheelchair traveling with an Irish cowboy would be remembered at every way station, every town, every crossroads between here and anywhere else. Then we fight. She turned to look at him, this man who had chosen her when the world called her worthless, who saw strength where others saw limitation, who loved her enough to stand against the storm that was coming. With what? He owns the sheriff, owns the doctor, owns half the town through debt or favor. He don't own us, true enough, but ownership wasn't required for destruction. Silas had other tools, legal ones, social ones. The kind that crushed people slowly, methodically, without leaving marks that showed. There might be another way, she said quietly. Tobias waited. He had learned to recognize the tone that meant her mind was working, turning over possibilities like a blacksmith examining metal for flaws. Those papers I mentioned, my mother's inheritance documents, they're not just claims to property. Her voice grew stronger as the plan took shape. They prove fraud, years of it. Silas has been stealing from an estate that legally belongs to me. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You're talking about taking him to court. I'm talking about taking everything he stole. The ranch, the cattle, all of it. The plan was audacious as lightning striking uphill, dangerous as dancing with wolves, but it had the virtue of being unexpected. Silas would never believe she possessed the documents, the knowledge, or the courage to challenge him legally. Over the next 3 days, they prepared. Cordelia retrieved papers hidden beneath loose floorboards in her old bedroom. Documents her mother had secreted away before her death, insurance against a husband who might prove less honorable than he claimed, marriage certificates, property deeds, bank records showing deposits made in her mother's name, evidence of a paper trail that Silas thought had been buried with his wife. How long have you known about these? Tobias asked, studying the careful handwriting that documented years of financial transactions. Since I was 18. My mother told me where to find them before she died, said someday I might need proof of what belonged to us. Her mother had been wiser than anyone suspected, wise enough to document everything, wise enough to prepare for betrayal, wise enough to trust her daughter with weapons that could topple kingdoms built on lies. But the revelation went deeper than hidden papers. That same evening, as they organized evidence by lamplight, Cordelia showed him the ranch ledger she had been keeping. Not just the books Silas knew about. Secret records of every transaction, every theft, every falsified entry. I've been copying everything for 3 years, she said. Every time I worked on the ranch accounts, I made notes, kept track of discrepancies. Tobias stared at pages of meticulous documentation, Dates, amounts, witness names. A prosecutor's dream wrapped in feminine handwriting. You've been planning this since the accident. I've been surviving since the accident. This is planning. The difference was everything. Survival was about enduring one day at a time. Planning was about building toward justice, no matter how long it took. The final piece of her strategy revealed itself when she pulled out a collection of letters, correspondence with lawyers in Santa Fe, territorial officials, men who dealt in property law and inheritance disputes. You've been writing to them for 6 months, building a case, establishing legal standing. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. Silas isn't the only one who knows how to pull strings. The scope of her preparation stole his breath. While he had been falling in love with her intelligence and courage, she had been orchestrating a campaign that would have impressed generals. Every conversation, every favor, every small kindness had been cataloged and converted into potential advantage. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to know you'd stay for me, not for what I could give you. The honesty cut deep as any blade. She had been testing him even as she trusted him, measuring his character against the weight of secrets that could destroy them both if mishandled. And now we see if 3 years of careful work can stand against 30 years of Silas Whitmore's cruelty. Outside, night sounds began their ancient chorus. Somewhere in the darkness, Silas was probably planning his next move, confident in his power to reshape their lives according to his will. He had no idea that the woman he had dismissed as broken was about to break him in return. The war was coming, but for the first time since her accident, Cordelia held weapons that might actually win it. Silas arrived at dawn with Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies, their badges catching early sunlight like warning signals. The sound of multiple horses brought Cordelia to her window. She watched them dismount with the casual authority of men accustomed to having their way. "Time's up, Brennan," Silas called from the yard. Tobias emerged from the barn, pitchfork still in his hands. He set it aside deliberately, his movements careful under the sheriff's watchful gaze. "What's this about?" Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, warrant papers rustling in the morning breeze. "Got a complaint here about theft and fraud. Need to search the premises." Cordelia wheeled onto the porch, her face composed as still water. She had been expecting this moment for 3 years. Every careful preparation had led to this confrontation. "What exactly are you looking for?" Silas's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Stolen property, ranch documents that belong to me, maybe some evidence of forgery while we're at it." The accusations hung in the air like gun smoke. Cordelia met his gaze without flinching. She had lived with his cruelty long enough to recognize the patterns. He always overplayed his hand when he thought victory was certain. "Search all you want," she said quietly. The sheriff and his men went through the cabin methodically. They found nothing. The documents were already safe in Santa Fe, filed with the territorial court 3 days earlier. Cordelia had learned caution from years of surviving Silas's unpredictable rages. When the search produced nothing incriminating, Silas's face darkened. "She's hidden them somewhere, probably buried them by the creek." "Can't arrest someone for hiding things that might not exist," Sheriff Morrison said. But Silas had other weapons. He pulled out commitment papers signed by Dr. Marsh, official documents declaring Cordelia mentally incompetent, a danger to herself and others. "Then we'll settle this different. She's clearly delusional. Thinks she owns property that belongs to me. That's grounds for commitment." Cordelia's hands tightened on her wheelchair's armrests. This was the moment she had prepared for, but preparation didn't eliminate fear. The asylum was still a possibility, still a threat that could destroy everything she had built. "Before you do anything permanent," she said, "you might want to read these." She handed the sheriff a bundle of papers tied with ribbon, legal documents bearing official seals, her correspondence with lawyers, property deeds, bank records. 3 years of careful documentation presented with the timing of a card sharp revealing a winning hand. Sheriff Morrison read slowly, his expression growing more troubled with each page. When he finished, He looked up at Silas with new wariness. "These papers say she owns half your ranch. Legal inheritance from her mother. Those are forgeries, has to be. They're filed with the territorial court, witnessed by Judge Hawkins himself." The sheriff's voice carried new respect. "Far as the law's concerned, these are legitimate." The power in the yard shifted like sand in wind. Suddenly, Silas was the one under scrutiny. His commitment papers meant nothing against legal documents that proved Cordelia's sanity, her competence, her right to challenge his authority. "There's more," Cordelia said quietly. She produced the ranch ledgers, her meticulous records of every theft, every falsified entry, every dollar Silas had stolen over 3 years. Evidence that painted a picture of systematic fraud conducted by a man who thought himself above accountability. "Interesting reading," Sheriff Morrison said after examining the books. "Seems like there's enough here to question who's been stealing from who." Silas's face went white as bone. "She's lying, making up numbers to cause trouble. But the numbers matched too perfectly. Cross-referenced with bank records, witness statements, transaction dates that could be verified." Cordelia had built her case with the precision of a master carpenter, each piece supporting the whole. "Judge Hawkins wants to see you both in Santa Fe next week," the sheriff said. "Let the court sort out who owns what." After the lawman rode away, Silas stood alone in the yard, his certainty crumbling around him like a house built on sand. The woman he had dismissed as worthless had outmaneuvered him completely. "This ain't over," he said. Cordelia met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, it is." 3 weeks later, the territorial court ruled in her favor. Judge Hawkins found the evidence overwhelming. Silas was ordered to return stolen funds and surrender half the ranch to its rightful owner. The commitment papers were thrown out as fraudulent. More importantly for Cordelia, the court recognized her mental competence, her right to make her own decisions about marriage, property, and future. Society's opinion mattered less than legal standing, and she now had both. The town's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of scandal, people saw justice. A clever woman who had fought back against a cruel stepfather. A love story that had triumphed over impossible odds. Romance was powerful medicine for community judgment. 6 months after the trial, Cordelia and Tobias were married in the church where her mother had once worshipped. She wore her mother's dress, altered to accommodate her wheelchair. He wore his best suit and a smile that could have lit the whole territory. They honeymooned at their own ranch, the one they now own together, equal partners in property and life. The cabin by the creek became their first home, expanded with rooms for the future they were building together. Winter found them planning next year's crops, next decade's improvements. Cordelia managed the books and business correspondence. Tobias handled livestock and land management. They had discovered that partnership multiplied strength rather than dividing it. On quiet evenings, they sat by the fire and read together. Sometimes ranch business, sometimes poetry, sometimes letters from his sister back east, whose health had improved dramatically once her medical bills were paid. The wheelchair remained part of their daily reality, but it had stopped defining that reality. Cordelia moved through their world with confidence earned through struggle and victory. She was neither victim nor inspiration. Simply, a woman who had claimed her rightful place in a world that had tried to deny her existence. Some nights when wind moved through cottonwoods by the creek, they talked about the journey that had brought them together. From cruelty to kindness, from survival to love, from impossible circumstances to improbable happiness. They had learned that dignity couldn't be given or taken away. It lived in choices made when choices seemed impossible, in love offered without guarantee of return, in standing up to power when standing seemed futile. The creek continued its eternal flow past their window, carrying old burdens downstream while bringing fresh possibilities with each new season. Like the water, they had found their way around obstacles that once seemed insurmountable. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ruins of what others had discarded. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.